Hello world, and welcome to stackCast, your go-to source for all things related to cloud security and cybersecurity compliance. I'm your host, Martin Rieger, and I'm thrilled to embark on this journey with you as we navigate the ever-changing landscape of cloud technology and cybersecurity. In a world where our reliance on digital technology is an all-time high, the need for secure and compliant data practices through states and federal government has never been more crucial. So buckle up and join us for this exciting journey as we delve into the world of federal cloud security and cybersecurity compliance. We hope to make this podcast not only informative, but engaging and interactive. So we encourage you to share your thoughts, questions, and experiences. And who knows, you might be featured in one of our future episodes. Thank you for tuning in to stackCast. We can't wait to embark on this enlightening journey with you. Let's discover, design, and deploy our digital future together. All right, hello, and welcome to the latest episode of stackCast. I'm your host, Martin Rieger. I'm joined today by Steven Vries, CEO and co-founder of IriusRisk. They're an industry leader in automated threat modeling and secure software design. They have a very impressive portfolio, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Steven, welcome to stackCast.
Thanks so much for having me, Martin, and great to be here.
So we're thrilled to have you. I definitely want to dive right in. And I will tell you, even within stackArmor and many of our partners, a lot of folks have no idea what threat modeling is. It's very new. It's also an up-and-coming requirement under FedRAMP. Can you, in your own words, just explain to us what threat modeling is and why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, threat modeling is one of those foundational activities for building secure software. And before you go and build anything, if it's software or a building or a car or some piece of physical machinery or whatever it is, you usually want to design it right in the first place. And what threat modeling is this act of analyzing the design of a system, identifying security problems in that design, and then planning what you're going to go and do about it. So, a great analogy is if you're building a house, you usually have an architect who's going to design the house for you, and the architect's going to choose the right kind of beams to go across the right kind of length of room to support the floor above it. They're going to choose the right kind of materials here and there to build a safe house or a safe dwelling for you. And in software development, we're just so used to running and moving so quickly that oftentimes we don't look at the design phase. And that's really what threat modeling is all about, is take a step back before you start writing code. Let's look at the design of this piece of software and just run through an exercise of what could an attacker do here? How could an attacker try and attack this design that you have? And how do you intend for your piece of software to defend itself against an attacker's attacks? That's what threat modeling is all about.
Awesome. So, that's where basically the automation piece comes in, right? In terms of how that's leveraged.
Yeah, exactly. So, what the world typically does when they do threat modeling, a lot of our customers, before they become our customers, the way they run a threat modeling activity is they get a security person. So the security person understands what an attacker can do against the system. They put this person in the room with a development team or an engineering team, and they will essentially try and answer 4 questions. Right. First question, what are we going to build? Or what are we building? What could go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? So that first question is essentially the security person leading the threat modeling exercise, asking the development team, like, draw me what you're going to build. Like, show me what the system looks like, just in a broad view of components and data flows. Let me understand what this thing looks like. And then the security person will then use that, the second, or will interrogate the team with the second question, right? I'm an attacker. I'm going to try and, change this value that you're sending from component A to component B. I'm going to tamper with it. I'm going to change it to a negative number instead of a positive number. What's your system going to do, right? And through this interaction between the security expert and the engineering experts, we arrive at a list of threats. Like, these are the things we are concerned about. These are the things that could go wrong with our system. And the next step is, well, what are we going to do about each of those? And there again, the security person provides the security know-how, and the engineering team provides their know-how of, these are the possible solutions we could put in place to mitigate these threats. Now, what we do at IriusRisk is we automate the process. So instead of having a security person in the room, the engineers can log into IriusRisk. They can draw their diagram in IriusRisk. They answer questions that our software presents to them, and our software automatically goes and generates a list of threats and a list of proposed countermeasures. So really, the main value add here for our customers is that they can scale this activity out to a much broader team of engineers. Bear in mind that a lot of security teams, the proportion of how many AppSec professionals do you have versus how many developers, in high-performing, high-maturity teams, that's a ratio of 1 to 100. And usually, in most companies, it's 1 to 300. So for every 300 developers, I've got one security person that can help those developers build a secure piece of software. And that's really the bottleneck that prevents security being embedded into a lot of engineering activities. So we solve that by removing the security person, use a piece of software to automate that, and so the developers have a more of a self-service approach to finding out what are the threats in the design of a software that they're building.
Man, that's music to my ears, I will tell you. So I'm the security guy in this equation. And, essentially what you guys are doing are breaking down and busting the silos between security, development, and engineering, right? That's a huge challenge. And I think it's one that, when we talk about architecture and engineering and designing with security in mind from the beginning, understanding these threat models is a game changer, right? In terms of how development teams operate.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you used that word. Communication is the key here. It's we often, or I often hear this sometimes with AppSec professionals saying, developers don't understand security, they don't know about security, and so on. And it's not true. Developers are extremely smart people. They know very well what they're building. It's just that security has become kind of a niche area, and how attackers can attack a piece of software is a fairly specialized area at the moment. And all you really need is just to take that knowledge, bring it over to the engineers, show them what attackers can do, and engineers will very quickly figure out, we can stop that by doing this or by doing that or by implementing one or other solution. So it's absolutely essential, I think, that engineering teams start having a security capability within those teams. We're never going to be able to build secure services if security is always kind of bolted on after the fact. You always have to call out to the security team, and they're going to bring some security magic fairy dust, sprinkle it on your software, and all of a sudden it's secure. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that for quality. It doesn't work like that for performance. If you want to build a performant piece of code, you need to design it to be performant, and your engineers need to build it, like that from the start. And it's the same for security. Those engineers need to build a secure piece of software themselves, and they need to have that capability themselves.
It's funny, baked in versus bolted on, right? And I have a colleague who has huge issues with the idea of baking in versus bolting on, because he's like, well, you can't bake in nuts and bolts, right? So bolting on security later, so to speak, or adding those components is a much more difficult process. One thing I'm very interested in that you touched on a second ago was the ability to diagram, right? And establish, talk about the boundary and what's in scope. When it comes to all of the risks and the vulnerabilities and the exploits and inventory and things like SBOMs and software bill of materials, how does that play a role and tie back into this? Is it more geared towards strictly developing and engineering, or are you pulling in from all available kind of data and resources?
So that's a great question. And our we often have that question from prospects, when they're evaluating our software. They want to know, so if I'm diagramming a web application, can I tell it what version of Java I'm using and what version of the app server, and you're going to go and find the vulnerabilities and so on. And we don't do that. And the reason we don't do that is because there are already a lot of pieces of software that will do that for you automatically, right? They will look at the version of software that you're using, go and consult the central database, NVD, come back with a list of vulnerabilities for that piece of software. So when we designed IriusRisk, we wanted to be 100% focused on that design aspect, right? So you as the software engineer, what do you need to know about the system that you're building? And that's the context that we work with. So if the threat that we identify is you're using an out-of-date piece of software and the fix is go and update it, that's not something that's really interesting from a threat modeling perspective. From a threat modeling perspective, we're more interested in how does the system function together. We're looking at it very much from a forest view, not a tree view. And from the forest view, we want to know, is this thing structured correctly? Like, are you sending data to the right places? Could an attacker change the way data is sent? Are you storing data where you should store it? And are you storing it using the right kind of encryption or not? So those kind of design aspects are, for us, more interesting for an engineer designing a piece of software, rather than the more, kind of infrastructure layer of go and update this thing because it's out of date. There's a lot of software that can already do that for you automatically.
Okay. And I mean, encryption is a good topic to touch on when we think about, up until a year ago, FIPS 140-2 at whatever level. Oddly enough, our last discussion or our previous podcast was with SafeLogic to talk about that process. But as it relates to threat modeling, from a framework perspective, is Arius predefined? In other words, is there the capability to align to specific frameworks, or is it more of an all-encompassing approach?
Yeah, a bit of both. So we have the capability where, by default, we have a knowledge base within IriusRisk. So by default, we're giving you kind of industry standard guidance, unless you say that you want more specific guidance. So if you say, I want to comply with PCI DSS, or I want to comply with the EU GDPR, or that, one of the NIST standards, we've got those listed down there. And you can say, well, in addition to this kind of standard best practice view, I want to also see the additional things I need to do in order to comply with this specific standard. So you can overlay that on your model, and then we're going to give you much more specific guidance. And we're also going to make a distinction between countermeasures that IriusRisk recommends you apply and those that you are required to comply. So as soon as you say, I want to comply with NIST, we will automatically flip a whole bunch of security requirements into the required state. So we'll say, you don't have an option of whether you want to do it or not. You really have to do this if you want to comply with one of the NIST standards. And I think that's something that, a lot of our customers, particularly in the regulated spaces, absolutely need. They do need to comply with specific standards, and they need to show that they've thought about this at design time. They intend to comply with a particular standard, and this is the set of tasks that they need to go and complete in order to comply with that standard.
Perfect. So then, from that perspective, I think that ties in a little bit to my next question, because you sort of touched on it, but from an investment standpoint, right? So the customers that you're working with day in and day out, and the guidance that's coming, they have budgets, and they have compliance, and they have objectives they've got to meet. How does IriusRisk guide companies in determining where the best areas are to invest from a security standpoint? I mean, we talked about encryption for a moment. We talked about a little bit on the development side and engineering, but can you describe just a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think what's key to making investment decisions is understanding risk. And if you understand the risk to your system, you can then start making intelligent trade-offs between how much do I want to invest and where do I want to invest it. So let's maybe take the opposite view. Let's say you're not doing threat modeling. So you're not analyzing your design. You don't know what your system looks like. Instead, what you've got is 50 different services, and you run these through a code scanner, and you run code scanning tools on them, and you find 300 security vulnerabilities in these 50 different services, and they're all critical, right? So which do you fix, right? Where do you start? And that's a problem that a lot of companies face. It's just this, they're overwhelmed with security information and security tasks. And what threat modeling gives you is the ability to say, okay, well, just let me have a look at what is the picture of this application. There are 50 different services. Which of those services is internet facing? How many users are using that internet facing service? Where is data being stored? What kind of data is used where in which of these 50 different interconnected services? And once you have that map and that picture, you have a much better understanding of where are the high risk parts to my application? Like what is really critical to me in this complex application of 50 different services, and what is not so critical? And once you have that view, you can now start making a lot more intelligent decisions about, well, this is the piece that we really want to protect, and it's these vulnerabilities that we really need to fix as a high priority. Those over there we'll get to, but these are not day one things that we need to fix. So, having that planning view for security, I think, is essential, and a big part of the value proposition of threat modeling is just to understand, what does this entire system look like? What do I care about in this application? And particularly modern applications, it's not just one piece of code. It's a number of different services. Sometimes they're even services of third parties that you're calling, and you're storing data in different geographies. So all of that is feeds into what you need to understand about how does my system work and what matters to me from a security perspective.
That's perfect. So with that in mind, this is more for me, and I'm kind of curious. Can you describe some of the most, or maybe one or two of the most unique challenges you guys have faced from a threat modeling perspective, either from the developer side or security and compliance side?
So the challenges that we faced, I think, so the challenges we have is that we build an automated system that should be able to model the kinds of applications that our customers are building. And I think the biggest challenge we have is more around the business logic of those applications. So one of the newer features that we've just released last month is the ability to define specific business logic features within your threat model. So you could say, we're doing payments on this web API, right? Or we have a password reset function on this web API. And we've then defined the threats and the countermeasures that are typical for a password reset function or for a payments function. The challenge we have is there are so many different types of those kinds of functions that, it's kind of a challenge of boiling the ocean, of trying to find all the possible ways you can implement a payment system and all the different types of business logic that a lot of our customers are building. So we need to kind of walk a fine line between creating threat models that are so generic that they would apply to, most systems, or that are so specific that they provide you with very good information, but you really have to be doing exactly that way in order for it to apply to you. So it's I think it's something that's very typical of templating in general. When you go and create templates for how something should work, if you create the template too specifically, it applies to some cases. Where if you create it too generally, it applies to many more, but it becomes so generic that it's not as useful. And that's the biggest challenge I think we have internally. When we create this knowledge base of threats that we use to generate our threat models, is this balance between being generic and being very specific.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's a tremendous amount of insight. And I mean, when you think about where IriusRisk is today, I'm going to kind of flip this, which is to say, what led you to basically go off and develop your solution as it relates back to threat modeling. How did you get into this? Because it's not something, one, that a lot of folks are doing. It's still in draft within NIST, right? So the National Institute Standards and Technology, Special Pub 800-154, which is a guide to data-centric systematic threat modeling. And now more recently, you've got the FedRAMP baselines released just 75 days ago, back on May 30th, where there is a specific NIST control dedicated to this, right? So like SA 11.2, which is threat modeling and vulnerability analysis for developers. What I'm most curious about is you guys are clearly ahead of the game and years ahead of all of this. How did you get into this, and what led you to create IriusRisk?
So firstly, threat modeling itself is not new. It was, I think one of the books, which I've got somewhere here, was written by Microsoft, and I think it was 2004, 2005, where they had this huge security initiative to make SQL Server a lot more secure. They had a patch of vulnerabilities, and they wanted to improve the security of SQL Server. So they kind of overhauled their entire secure development process at Microsoft. And one of the things they did was introduce this concept of threat modeling there. And that was, I think, one of the first publications around how do you do threat modeling, and what is it, and how does it work, and so on. So between then and now, threat modeling, I think that the majority of the industry currently does threat modeling what we would call manually, which is this whiteboard activity of security person talks to developers, and in that interaction, they collaboratively build a threat model, by using a whiteboard and by just writing down the number of threats and by thinking out and thinking about threats and countermeasures. So I came very much from that heritage, right? I used to do a lot of threat modeling training for developers. I used to do those exercises, and you do it once, it's fun. You do it 20 times, still a bit fun. But the 21st time you're thinking, man, this is something a piece of software could really do at least 80% of what I'm doing here. And that was really the inspiration for creating IriusRisk, was to automate a large part of this threat modeling activity, to say, you don't need a person standing in front of a development team to do this. A piece of software can bring a lot of value here. And for our customers, it gives them the ability to scale, right? They don't have to call in an external consultant or get this security expert, which, as you well know, not many of us around compared to a number of developers. You don't need to get them in to do this heavyweight exercise. You can do it a lot faster, a lot quicker, and a lot cheaper if you're using software to do a lot of the heavy lifting.
So with that in mind, supply chain risk management is another, like threat modeling. It's not really new, but it's a new mandate. It's a new requirement. The NIST 853 Rev 5 added an entire family to it, which is, of course, our supply chain risk management family, adding things like policies, procedures, and plans. This is another area where IriusRisk can support threat modeling for supply chains too, correct?
Absolutely. And I think it's an area, supply chain is an area where I think threat modeling is underused, and it could be a very valuable artifact to be used in supply chains. Imagine if you went to, I'll go back to cars again. I don't know why they keep coming up with this analogy, but imagine you go and buy a car, and the vendor says it's safe. And you ask, well, why is it safe? In what way is it safe? And the vendor says, don't worry, it's safe. Just trust me, right? That's not good enough for me as somebody who's going to buy something like that, right? What I'd like to know is, what tests have they run against the car? What safety standards does it meet? What have you actually done to prove that the thing is safe? And I think that's where threat modeling can bring a very valuable perspective on software. Is if I'm going to purchase a piece of software and I could ask the vendor, well, show me your threat model. Show me what you thought were things that could go wrong with your software, and show me what you did to mitigate those threats. And maybe you decided not to mitigate everything. It's not always essential that every single threat has a countermeasure. Maybe you made a decision and said, the likelihood of this particular threat attack is extremely low, or the impact is very low. We consciously decided not to implement a countermeasure here. Fine, but let me know that, right? Communicate that to me as the person who's purchasing this piece of software from you. So I think coming back to that word used earlier, communication. A threat model is a great way to communicate that from supplier or from vendor to purchaser. Like, this is what we thought was important from a security perspective. This is what we did about it. Here's our map. Here's our model, and this is what we've done for security.
Funny when you made the car analogy, for some reason a Yugo came to mind. I remember as a kid going to open the door and the handle came off, and then we tried to roll down the window and that came off. And I mean, it's 100% spot on. So my last real kind of question would be is we've talked about what I would say is compliance and development for security. What other areas can threat modeling be applied to? Because while those are very focused, and I think the majority of our listeners are going to be geared towards those compliance things, are there other industries where threat modeling can be applied? Like, for example, healthcare, finance?
Yeah, so the majority of our clients are in the financial services sector. So and I think it's really because of two reasons. Firstly, they trust from their customers is very important. Therefore, security is important. And they just build a phenomenal number of applications. Like they're building software, and you go to your bank and you'll be familiar with the website and maybe the mobile app, but they've got thousands of applications running internally and for different reasons behind that. And all of that needs to be secure. So financial services is very important, and they regard security as a key requirement for them. Recently, the FDA has released guidance that they will not approve medical devices for sale in the US unless there's a threat model for that medical device. So, I think that's a great example of how important it is just to have that communication. Like, hey, you're gonna implant this thing in somebody's body. Show me what you thought were important from a security perspective here and what you did about that. So, the FDA guidance is very good for devices. We've seen the same for industrial control systems. So somebody building devices that are used in industrial setting, same thing. They should show threat models for that so that the people purchasing that can understand, that they are secure. And because, a lot of those have a lifetime that is longer than a piece of software. They're difficult to update. So getting security right is quite important in those physical areas of security.
Well, these are fantastic insights, and I feel like I could probably go all day because you just have a wealth of knowledge. So I'm sure our audience learned a lot today, not just about threat modeling, but the future of secure software design and how automation is changing the game, especially with IriusRisk. So on behalf of stackArmor, I'd like to thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for the interview, Martin. Really been a great conversation.
So thank you, everyone, for tuning in today into this episode of stackCast with IriusRisk. As always, stay curious and informed, and most importantly, stay safe. So until next time, goodbye.